I just want to start off with some thank yous. Claire and the folks here at Sediment have been absolutely tremendous in making this happen. It's been a long time coming, and it's been such a pleasure working together. And then Dana, thank you so much for all your help with all the technical assistance. Also the Craft Material Studies Department colleagues for their support and bringing me on board as faculty and being a part of the Richmond community. It's been absolutely fabulous thus far. Sarah Ferguson for including me in your posts for Sculpture and Dimensional Studies. I really, really appreciate it. Sorry, Extended Media. Sorry, that's from Alfred. And then Peter Cochran for his help with photography in the show. And then finally, my studio assistant, Nick Soroka, who just completely saved my ass this summer with just family and personal stuff just kind of happening. My studio was just constantly going thanks to him. And the show would have not have happened without him, absolutely. So, and he can't be here because he's actually over at Open House. So, you know, a lot of things happening. So I love gallery talks, and I think my favorite is when we just talk about the things that you can't see. And so things that are going on inside my brain that I can't see, but I'm going to try to tell you kind of how I arrived at this work. And I think the best way to start is actually thinking about, I came off of a solo museum show last year. It closed at the beginning of January last year in Alfred at the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum for a show titled Hereafter. And so in that show, I was thinking a lot about what it means to go through a single day and to be able to actually look back through a single day, not through memory, but physically. Like, how can we work ourselves through it and then backwards and then through it as many times as we want. And my interest, it was at a ceramic art museum, but nothing in the show was ceramic. And I started thinking about what ceramics is as a material, and it is forever. And ceramics tells the stories of our lives. It tells the stories of generations that came before. And ceramics is forever. And no matter how much we crush it down, it actually, on a molecular level, will never be the same again. And I was thinking about, well, that's true, and that's really beautiful, but like, how can I task ceramics with actually being more vulnerable and being essentially as ephemeral as we are as humans? And I arrived at newspaper. And newspaper is a document that actually tells collective stories of our lives. And what's interesting too is that paper being ephemeral, but also like newspaper is kind of on the out right now, and slowly but surely we're losing this kind of this free document that's available to people, whether it is you can see it in flying through the wind on the street, but I really, really love that potency in material. And in that show, I was also thinking about how theater and sculpture operate in tandem. And in that show, I was using Stephen Sondheim lyrics and carving them into wood and thinking about what it means to see a lyric rather than hear a lyric, and what it means to actually write a lyric down or even carve a lyric permanently into something. But there is one piece from that show, other than just the process of newspaper. It was a piece titled "Dream On," and it's a piece that I created a sunrise or a sunset, however you want to see it, using a flashlight, a few pieces of plexiglass, some neon, and a tripod, where I was attempting to use a flashlight to be the sun. And how completely ridiculous that is and kind of dumb. And I really love the way in which we go about trying to simulate these natural elements on Earth. So there are two pieces of literature and a work of art that kind of really ushered in this exhibition. And I'm going to start with, I think it's my favorite piece of sculpture by Ilya Kabakov called "The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment." And I saw that piece when I was my first year of graduate school, and it has changed my life. If you don't know that piece, it's a total installation. Actually, he coined the term total installation, and it's this installation where it's this man's bedroom, and there's springs coming from all four corners of the bed, and a seat in the center. There's a hole in the ceiling, and clearly he has gotten to space from his apartment. And there are drawings and models on how he's going to do it, and failed attempts, and how that's going to happen. And I thought, this is like such a beautiful, really silly, but gorgeous work of art, because it's really about fiction, and it's really playing on how we process fiction, and kind of giving us, I guess, empowering us in terms of fiction, and getting us to kind of finish the story, what happened after, what happened before. Then it's my favorite Italo Calvino short story called The Distance of the Moon, and it's a love story, which, if you know my work, I really love love stories. But it's talking about the time period where the moon and the earth eventually touch. And there's this wife and his sailor in this boat on Earth, and they have this deaf assistant that's with them. And when the moon gets close enough, they can climb a ladder, and they can gather what they call moon milk off the surface of the moon as nourishment for their bodies and as food. And it's this really beautiful story about the relationship of the wife and the moon and the assistant. They kind of have this like love affair, where towards the end, she actually ends up trying to get onto the moon to help him gather the moon milk, and then she actually gets swept away by the moon, and so he's waiting for her to come back around again. And that was huge in terms of the sword, and kind of this meeting between the marigold and the sword. And then lastly, Truman Capote's novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms. It's my favorite of his works, and that's where I got the title Noon City from. Noon City in the book is this place that this 13-year-old boy who is queer, we don't know it yet in the book, but he's actually hasn't seen his father since his birth, and he's hitchhiking cross country from New Orleans to go and find his father, who is in Noon City. And he meets a bunch of people along the way who have heard of it, but none of them have actually been to it. And I use that as kind of a parallel to kind of post-world human existence, to think about, what does it mean if a day or how we understand time doesn't exist anymore? Who are we as like a civilization if continents, nations, lines of demarcation, systems of power, what happens when we get rid of that and we actually are on the moon? And I was also thinking about without dirt, without clay, without ceramics, like how will we understand, how will we know how civilizations came before? Like what will be the new document? Like what will art, objects, what will those mean? And will they be necessary? And how will we go about to actually do that? So that brings me to this really interesting material, moon dust. And so I was driving to the grocery store. My dog was really sick, and I was driving and he was vomiting, and I was like, well, how do I looked it up. I was like, oh, pumpkin, actually, just in case you need that. But I was like, oh my God, I was like, the moon is the new ceramic. That's exactly what it is. Like, that's the only material we're gonna have. It's the basis. It's really funny, but it's like, as humans, we look down to begin again. We look to Earth. We look to that space below us to begin. And in terms of even root systems, or even in times of desperation. And so I was like, oh my God, it has to be moon dust. So I looked up online, and it was $25 million for a small little rock of the moon. And I was like, that's not gonna work, because I need more than that. So I found these two scientists out of the University of Central Florida doing research on a lunar simulator. And they apparently were working on various types for Mars and the moon, and they had done core samples, and they were kind of working on different like layers of Mars and different layers of the moon in terms of like, can we grow things in it, and can we simulate it for NASA, for astronauts. And so when it came in the mail, I like stuck my hand in the bag. And like, it's really cool. I had this like out of body experience of just like I felt like I was like one of the few people who had been to the moon, you know, for that like moment, you know, where you're like, I'm touching this thing that is totally fiction and totally not really the moon, but like how wonderful it is that like imagination isn't dead, even in the moment like that, where you're like, oh, I can still use this material to reimagine what it would be like to begin again, or to try this new ceramic dirt. So, and actually, I have some. If you want to feel some moon dust before you leave, I have some in the back. It's actually really cool. It kind of reminds me of like Amelie, you know, when she puts her hands inside the beans. Like, that's kind of how I felt, where you're like, that feels really nice. It's also really cold, shockingly. It actually holds on to like, well, it's not thermal, I guess, but I guess it is, because it's like, it can hold on to coolness. But so when you enter the exhibition, I'm just going to kind of walk through. I'm not going to walk through each piece, but I'm going to kind of tell you like the framework for which this stuff exists. I was thinking about that moment of the moon dust that I had touching it, and I just wanted you to kind of walk in and maybe be on the moon just for a minute, and like this like simulated moment where like Earth is upside down, using the marigold. And then also, this is me standing on the moon, and then that's also moon dust, this like mirror that actually can't reflect. And thinking about a point. This is a part of a series that I'm working on right now titled Axes, and this is one of infinity. And I have another one over there that's two of infinity. And so I also really like the idea that these works, well, like a point can be infinite. And like, I really kind of love how, like, I use this word dumb a lot, but I really love that word because it's just completely irrelevant. In space, right? And it also kind of does the things in art school that you're not supposed to do, which is like put anything in the center, which I really love, like doing that. Where you're just like, I'm creating a grid, I'm telling you the grid, and I'm putting it in the center. So then I wanted you to kind of walk through, and then you would end up in this bag. And so I kind of opened this tarp bag thing, and the idea was that in all of these objects, they're kind of simulators in ways. You know, the whoopee cushion simulates like farting, and what do you call it? They're gunshots, but they're a paintball gun. Is like a simulation of a shot and then blood, and then thinking about in terms of the pipe wrench, thinking about water, and that would be irrelevant as well, and thinking about candles being fire. And so I was thinking about, if we were all in this space, if we were to be cinched by the bag and carried to the moon, that the objects that we would leave behind are the very objects that make being on Earth human. And you know, without gravity, without water, without a lot of the things that we depend on, we would have to begin again in a different kind of civilization, and a different kind of human would start again. And this kind of evolution that I don't think we thought possible. So I also want to kind of tell you the things that I'm thinking about now. So something that I didn't really foresee happening with the moon dust, but I really don't like the idea of the moon dust being a permanent object. And so right now I'm working with it to create a wishing well. that will be infinitely demolished and reused using the moon dust. So I'm actually not going to use any adhesive or anything in it. I like the idea of it being extremely vulnerable to the space that it's in, kind of crumbling before your eyes, even when you walk past it. And I'm also working on a shower stall right now. It's a life-size shower stall that's made out of maple wood that'll be folded in 3D modeling, and then it's going to be folded like a towel. And this kind of idea of putting rain to bed. That's what showers do. They simulate rain, so we can bathe. And so I was thinking about, well, what happens when rain dies? And so I wanted this kind of object that performed that. And so I'm working on those two works I have a solo show opening at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design next summer. And so I'm trying to get those out in time for that. That's my goal. I'm gonna leave you with a quote. It's my favorite quote by Jeanette Winterson. She's like one of my favorite writers. But she says, if all art is concerned with truth, then a society in denial will not have much use for it. And I think that quote really is something that I sit with often when I think about the works that I make in terms of fiction and how closely aligned fiction is with truth. So that's it. Cool. Thank you. So, any questions? Yeah, I'm going to grab some water. Yes.
So there's a lot of humor in here, and humor in some ways is sort of this psychological space that we touch, but we don't want to go quite over it. And you kind of parallel that with dystopia a little bit and with love. Do you want to talk a little bit more for me about what that humor does for you and how I think you may draw audiences into that and then you let us sit with love? I don't know, is that wrong?
No, I think that's...
I don't know what my question is, I just want to hear more about that.
So I think, so humor, when humor is good, the reason why it's good is because it almost fails. Like, that's why we laugh. And you know, if it gets to that point where it just almost does a thing, we're like, oh my God, it didn't, and then that's the, that's the funny part. That's the punchline. I think I use humor as coping mechanisms a lot in relationships, actually throughout everything in my life. I think I love to laugh, and I don't really use it as like deflection rather, but it's like, I think that like, I grew up in a very honest home where like my mom would say the most like, she would say things like, you're gonna wear that? And I'd be like, yeah, because you're wearing that. And that was kind of like our relationship, and I think that and then that was funny, right? And so we kind of, I kind of sometimes come to truths with humor. I remember my ex, his grandmother had passed, and we were like driving into Manhattan, and he was like, I love you, but whatever you do, can you please not try to make me laugh today? And I was like, okay. And I didn't realize that I did that as often as I did, but like I was like, ooh, this is like, trying to, like, how can you find humor in a funeral, kind of thing. And I was actually doing that on the way, like trying to think of, like, I was like, well, how can I make him feel better? I'll make him laugh. And so, but I think that like, I really love when objects, when I do a lecture, like a formal lecture, my favorite scene from Steel Magnolias is this scene where Sally Field is standing at the casket of her daughter who had just passed, and she starts crying, and it's a 30-second frame, and then she starts laughing, and so there's this like transition of emotion. And I've always wanted my objects to be able to have that scene, to like have that moment where somebody actually can cry and they can laugh in the same moment with an object. I think that doesn't really happen all the time, but I like to think that it can. Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting because most of the time when I see lectures or people speaking about your work, the research component veers towards nonfiction. And so to hear you reference fiction and theater, this idea of verisimilitude is kind of refreshing. I'm wondering if you can talk more about that. Like, do you find fiction is sort of part of a research or storytelling?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about devices. Like I read because they're always a different device to hook or to keep reading. To be honest, until you said something, I didn't know there was any difference. Like I never thought about like one being more than the other in terms of like research. Like, I mean, to be honest, I think as far as research, like it's funny. Like when I was
It's a terrible word.
Research. I know, it's like, oh God, that sounds really arduous, and I feel like I'm sitting in a library or something. But I think when I started a conversation with these scientists, it's really funny because even me doing research and trying to figure out this material and a new material, I was trying to figure out a new material based in fiction, that it was like fake moon dust. So even in that attempt to like be serious and be nonfiction about it, I was attempting that. But I think like I grew up with like my parents weren't really around very much when I was a kid, and so my sister and I watched movies a lot and soap operas. So I think that like in terms of fiction, I've never really saw them being different. Like that they were very real because, and now I'm telling you the adult version of me, which is like they're very real because that story is more than likely based on a story that somebody else had that's been written. So like I think that honestly, nonfiction is inescapable within fiction. Like even in terms of like Star Trek, Star Trek teaches us about empathy. The whole show is about empathy. So, and that's very real in terms of like survival and what it means to celebrate difference and acceptance and queerness and also sameness too. So, yeah. Does that answer anything?
Yeah, it totally does. But I wonder this myself because you think about what is the use of romanticism in today's context when I think a lot of people can't tell the difference between fact and fiction. And that seems to be a goal with propaganda.
Yeah, that is a different coin altogether, I feel like when fiction's used against us, which makes me really sad.
Well, I don't see that here. I see this. It's safe and useful and fun and playful and very thought-provoking, but I'm always trying to think, okay, how can I defend fiction, the suspension of disbelief.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is like a really good story. For instance, but not limited to, I've never seen the movie, so it's fine, Andre Assman's Call Me By Your Name. That book, I haven't read a book in probably 15 years that did that to me. I was enveloped in it, I believed it, And the time I was living in Alfred, and it was like the dead of winter, and I was pacing around the barn outside because I like had to like leave my couch. I had to leave like the space, and I was like crying the whole time. I just like was so enveloped in that story. And then I remember like finishing it and putting it down and being like I felt like I was a part of something, which was really beautiful. So I don't know. I think it's imperative for survival, I think. Like we have, actually it's something that I didn't talk about in the talk, but I wrote down on my thing, whatever. But like how the past is inescapable. And, when I was working on this show, I was thinking about, well, what if we could just begin again? Like, what if we all got to the moon and then we could just start over again? And then I thought to myself, what I'm asking of people is to forget everything that just happened. And that is impossible, because the very thing that just happened will be a story, and that story will be told. And those stories about their stories on Earth, and also the story of getting there, and that kind of migration will actually it's impossible, because it's also how we cope too, and we it's just like a matter of being understood, I think.
I think that is happening also just with the way that you treated the space. I wanted to talk about or see what you had to say. I don't have a complete thought, but it's, like covering the walls, peeling them back, like creating these surfaces that are here but being opened for other things to emerge, for the sword to maybe come through the floor or be embedded in the floor, and like objects like this that have hollowness, they're vessels, but the whoopee cushions are also vessels for possibilities, but they're also, seeming to kind of emerge from the floor, which is also a wall because it's white. And then, so what you've done with this space is really, I think, similar to what you're talking about too.
Yeah, it's suspension, and I think that I was thinking, I'm extremely afraid of heights. And so when I was making this piece, I was thinking about like that liftoff and like that initial liftoff where we all end up kind of, like a bag just forces everything to the center. And so I was just thinking about like how we all like would do that initial push together, but then that feeling of not feeling ground again. And so I was thinking about that with this work, about like if I could get you into that space of suspension just for like a second. And so that's where the bag comes from, the kind of windows that are made with the works, and even with the door, with the hallway cut out, that there was like seemingly an escape route or something as well, where things could come in or things could go out.
I started seeing them as like these possibilities of another realm coming through, and even like peeling back and going down the hallway, it was like entering another
dimension. Yeah, I mean, this was like a huge experiment. I think if you're doing anything right, most exhibitions are. Like, I think, like if you know everything, well, that's kind of boring. But like if I didn't really know, I never worked with tarp before or tried to sew it in such a massive shape. And I really, this kind of preparation and like how exhausting that preparation can be to leave someplace I was just thinking about that as well.
You were climbing ladders with your favorite height.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was standing on top of the ladders to like. Yeah. No. I like do not like heights, FYI. But I like roller coasters, shockingly enough. But I don't know. They put you in a harness, so all of a sudden you're safe or something.
Weird.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'm curious about like how you navigate like the difference between the how you navigate like where you place an object, not in physical space, but on the boundary between what's public and what's private. And I think there's a lot of active navigation with that, with the way that you simulate objects with like varying kind of degrees of verisimilitude too. So yeah, you could like talk about your thought process as it relates to like public versus private.
Yeah, I think the best way to answer that is to talk about like every work starts with like something from my romantic entanglements, like every single piece, like without a doubt. And so I have this thing where I don't really know. There's a space in which I can tell you too much, and that's not good, you know. And so I think that, for instance, I'm just going to start with like the Remember Me cup. That was purchased by my ex-boyfriend at a thrift store for like 50 cents, and he like kept it in his bag. And then before he left, one day he like we were living apart, and he like set it on my dresser, and it still had the like 50-cent thing written on the back of it, you know, whatever. And like that gesture was so beautiful. And then I started thinking about like the significance of that object that's so completely distant from how I received it. And I think that says a lot in terms of that distance, like how close can I get to you without touching you, kind of thing. And that's something that I think about in terms of making objects. So, which is weird because I came from like a production pottery background, like where I was making objects that you actually did touch. Anyway, side note. But then I also, I try to make things that I don't fully understand. Like I don't know the answers to the works that I make completely. I try to have this very, I think with ideas that we have, there is a expiration date on that idea. And we don't really know that expiration date in terms of making. So I have this theory that if I tell too many people an idea, or I write it down too many times, or I sketch it, like when it exits my body too many times, it'll actually expire. So like I know that and I know that, so I'm like, that's the like one thing where I'm like, don't do that, don't jinx it. So I always know that if I don't start on something or get it going, that is a possibility, but it can't be too much. Sorry, I'm getting to that point where it's like these are all. I guess it's a very layered answer because it is a relationship to the objects from which they've entered my life. It's also a relationship that comes from a relationship with a human being that I more than likely am in love with in some way, shape, or form. But then also my relationship to my ideas in terms of how to express those, and also know that you're really important to me as a viewer, right? So I think that it's like navigating those relationships. Is that cool? Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah. If you're shy and you don't like to talk in front of people, you're welcome to ask me a question. I'm going to grab a beer and then we can talk. Cool. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.